The vote board lights up. The new standard passes without Washington's approval. And the world realizes America isn't at the head of the table anymore. Chapter 1. The Turning Point. Not with a dramatic confrontation, not with a walkout, but with a quiet majority that has learned it can live without Washington's approval. In the months leading up to the meeting, the United States tried the old tools. Private pressure, warnings about security risks, promises of aligned alternatives. It worked on a few countries, the way it always did. It failed on the ones that mattered most. Because this time, the argument wasn't ideology. It was capability. For a decade, American influence traveled inside other things. The payment rails that made trade effortless. The chips that powered the data centers. The software stacks that became default. The security umbrella that made alignment feel like insurance. Now those defaults have competitors that are no longer second-rate. Chinese and Indian firms deliver AI models that are good enough to run factories, ports, and call centers without American cloud contracts. New semiconductor supply chains outside the United States scale faster than anyone expected, and good enough becomes available to countries that spent years being told to wait. Logistics platforms, satellite networks, and payment systems built in the developing world stop being patches. They become ecosystems. Europe adapts first because Europe can't afford to be caught between standards forever. It hardens its industrial policy, funds its own compute, and pours money into defense production until strategic autonomy stops sounding like a slogan. Then it begins signing direct deals with the fastest growing economies on Earth. Minerals, ports, green manufacturing, data centers. Europe doesn't leave the United States. It just stops waiting for it. Washington calls that kind of behavior disloyal. Europe calls it adulthood. The spark, the thing that turns a trend into a timeline, is small enough to fit into a meeting agenda. A digital trade framework that governs identity verification, cross-border data, and settlement rules for the next generation of commerce. The United States objects because the framework makes American platforms optional. It also objects because the framework is backed by a bloc large enough to survive retaliation. Europe votes for it anyway. So do enough emerging economies that used to split their choices and now see the advantage of one shared system. After the meeting, American officials give interviews that sound confident and feel defensive. They say the United States will lead a competing standard. They say adoption will be limited. They say security concerns will force reversals. Within weeks, the reversals don't happen. Instead, a handful of global banks announce they will support the new rails. Shipping insurers update their compliance policies. Multinational companies tell their teams to build for both systems, and then quietly staff the non-American system more heavily. The US didn't lose a war. It lost the privilege of being the rulebook. And once that privilege is gone, dominance doesn't end in a crash. It drains out through 1,000 decisions that used to be automatic. Chapter 2. The Early Effects. The first change is in paperwork. Not tariffs, not speeches, not flags. Procurement forms add new compliance lines. Contracts reference new dispute forums. Banks add new settlement channels that sit beside the old ones like a spare engine. Washington still has leverage, but it has to spend it more often, and spending it makes it look smaller. Sanctions begin to behave differently. They still hurt. They just stop being final. Countries learn to route around them with a mix of regional clearinghouses, commodity swaps, and payment networks that were once considered experimental. Workarounds are slower and more expensive than the American system, but they exist, and existence changes everything. The second change is in alliances. The United States has spent years on an America-first posture that treated relationships like transactions. Renegotiate the trade deal, charge for basing rights, threaten tariffs on friends to win leverage in domestic politics. Each move was defensible inside Washington. Each move taught allies the same lesson. The United States would use them, and it might abandon them, depending on the season. So allies start diversifying the way investors diversify. They keep the US position. They also buy others. Europe accelerates joint defense procurement until it can field large stockpiles without asking permission. It builds a security industrial pipeline that makes the continent less dependent on American replenishment. Then it uses that autonomy for something Washington doesn't expect: direct deals. European leaders travel to capitals in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America with offers that combine markets, investment, and security cooperation without the moral lecture that sometimes came with Washington's attention. China offers infrastructure and scale. Europe offers access and regulation. India offers labor, software, and a growing middle class. The developing world discovers it can negotiate from strength because there are now multiple bidders. In Washington, the response is sharper than the situation requires. Export controls tighten. Visa rules tighten. Industrial subsidies expand. The government tries to pull supply chains back home, then realizes home is expensive, then tries to pull them into trusted countries, then discovers those trusted countries are also making their own deals. American companies adjust faster than American politics. They build regional production. They rewrite risk models. They start treating US policy as one factor among many, not the top line. The global media keeps using the old phrase, the world's leading superpower, because it fits headlines. Behind the headlines, the new reality spreads. Influence is now something the United States has to win. It is no longer something it can assume. Then Europe signs the first deal that treats Washington as optional, and the world reacts as if it has been waiting to do that for years. Chapter 3. The cracks appear. The first real shock doesn't come from a battlefield. It comes from a deal. A major European economy signs a long-term industrial agreement with a coalition of emerging markets that ties energy, minerals, and manufacturing into a single supply chain. The agreement includes security provisions, port access, joint training, shared maritime surveillance. It is not a military alliance. It doesn't need to be. It is a durable structure that makes European and developing world interests interlock, and it is signed without Washington in the room. The United States responds the way it has been trained to respond. It warns about dependence. It threatens countermeasures. It signals that certain technologies will be restricted. And the counterparty smiles politely and continues. Because the counterparty has calculated something new. It can endure American pressure. Not forever. Long enough. That calculation becomes contagious. Then a security crisis finally arrives, the kind the United States used to solve by showing up. A regional power coerces a neighbor over access to a critical shipping corridor and a strategic undersea cable route. The United States prepares a response package: naval presence, intelligence sharing, targeted sanctions. The plan is solid. The execution hits a wall made of politics. Host countries attach conditions to basing access, not because they hate America, because they want assurances that the US won't turn the operation into a domestic spectacle and then pull out when the headlines fade. Europe offers a parallel plan, smaller and more local, built around regional partners and a faster decision cycle. China offers mediation paired with trade incentives. India offers patrol assets and a diplomatic channel that doesn't require alignment with either bloc. The crisis becomes a test of the new order. Washington is present. Washington is not central. The result is messy and unsatisfying. The corridor stays open after weeks of standoff, but the coercing state wins enough concessions to call it a victory. No one celebrates. Everyone remembers who moved first. Inside the Pentagon, planners begin rewriting assumptions about force projection. It isn't that the US military got weak. It's that the environment got crowded. Anti-ship missiles, cheap drones, cyber capabilities, and space-based surveillance make it harder to dominate any region without a large coalition. Coalitions, in turn, are harder to build when allies have alternatives. At home, the political fight sharpens into something more corrosive than partisanship. It becomes a fight over what the country is for. One side demands a renewed push for primacy. Another demands a retreat and reinvestment. Both are angry that influence now requires compromise. And while Washington argues about philosophy, The rest of the world keeps signing contracts that make American leadership less necessary. Chapter 4. The New Normal. Once the loss of dominance becomes visible, every major actor begins optimizing for it. Europe institutionalizes its autonomy. It expands defense production, builds shared stockpiles, and turns its procurement into an industrial engine that can keep running regardless of US election cycles. It also becomes a broker. European diplomats learn to mediate between developing blocs and Washington, because mediation is a form of power when no single actor can dictate terms. China adapts too. It stops trying to replace the United States everywhere at once. It focuses on corridors, trade routes, infrastructure networks, standards adoption, and the parts of the world where speed matters more than rhetoric. India and other rising economies exploit the gap. They take investment from everyone. They choose standards that benefit them. They play blocks against each other, not maliciously, but rationally. This is what multipolarity looks like in practice. It is less about flags and more about bargaining. The United States tries to recover the old posture by offering a new one. More predictability, more multilateralism, more patience. But the America First years left a residue. Allies remember tariff threats aimed at them. They remember defense commitments treated like invoices. They remember being asked to choose sides while the United States treated their economies as leverage. So the United States is welcomed back with limits. Partnerships come with clauses. Operations come with sunset dates. Technology cooperation comes with reciprocal access requirements. And the United States, used to writing the terms, has to decide whether it can live with being one signer among many. The private sector makes the adjustment irreversible. Companies build products that comply with multiple regulatory systems from day one. They build supply chains with redundancy as a baseline cost. They treat political alignment as a risk to be managed, not a destiny. In Washington, that looks like loss. In boardrooms, it looks like survival. The new normal stabilizes into something colder than the old order. Less faith, more contracts. Less ideology, more insurance. And for the first time, American power has to operate inside a world that doesn't automatically organize around it. Chapter 5. The World That Follows. In the settled world, global leadership is a rotating function. Different crises pull different centers to the front. Finance has more than one hub. Technology has more than one stack. Security has more than one umbrella. Rules are still written. They are just written through bargaining between blocks, and the bargaining leaves seams. Companies live in those seams. They keep separate data environments. They maintain parallel compliance teams. They store inventory like it's a strategic asset, not a cost to be minimized. Countries in the developing world feel the change most directly. They are no longer treated as arenas. They are treated as partners, markets, and swing votes. That status comes with opportunity and pressure at the same time. Europe becomes a quieter kind of superpower. Not a global sheriff, a global deal maker with a large market, a credible military, and the ability to set terms in trade, climate, and regulation. China remains a pillar, not because it dominates every domain, but because it cannot be ignored in any of them. The United States remains immensely capable. It still projects force, still produces innovation, still shapes culture, but it no longer gets to treat its preferences as the default settings of the planet. Americans notice the shift in ordinary places. A new phone doesn't ship with one ecosystem by default. A new international dispute isn't settled by a single call to Washington. A sanction announcement is not a verdict, but an opening move. The country is still democratic, still noisy, still powerful. It is simply living in a world where power has competitors that are competent, coordinated, and willing to build systems that do not require American permission. The dominance is gone. The nation is not. Epilogue. The branch in this timeline isn't a collapse. It is a convergence. Rising economies become capable enough to offer real alternatives. Europe becomes confident enough to act directly, and the United States spends years treating loyalty like a fee. None of those choices end American power on their own. Together, they end American inevitability. And once inevitability is gone, the world doesn't need to overthrow the old center. It only needs to learn how to operate without it.